Hello viewers, welcome to MOOC's online course on Visual Perception and Art, a survey across the cultures. This is the 13th lecture and today we shall be looking at traditional Indian art. And basically we will try to make a sense of how traditional Indian art created a visual culture of its own through its artworks. Even a cursory look at any random examples of traditional Indian art, be it sculpture or painting, initially evokes a couple of things. One, when you look at an example like this, for example, because of the accuracy of the represented objects or figures, for example, when you look at these birds, they give you an idea that these artists were very faithful to nature, very faithful to the living creatures, and no doubt about that. On the other hand, when you look at the different stylistic and structural components of these artworks, you also have a feeling that everything may not be so realistic as it appears in the first glimpse. Thirdly, in many cases, what is unmistakably there is a great amount of empathy, a great amount of feeling towards the subject or towards the object that has been represented or depicted. You also chance upon examples from traditional Indian art, examples which are very complex in nature, because not only that they tell you stories and the stories are very complex and multi-layered, also because, for example, this painting belongs to the Mughal period, and this painting was painted like many other hundreds of paintings during the Mughal period at the Mughal court, highly under the supervision of the patrons. And these paintings reflect the court culture, which itself was highly grand and complex, full of aspirations, and definitely the paintings were meant to reflect those elements which were there in the general visual culture of the court itself. Then, from a similar kind of historical context, not exactly Mughal, but Rajput paintings, and also it is a court painting, yet in this painting there is a simplicity in the depiction compared to the earlier one where you saw very complex composition. A huge amount of details were rendered, whereas in this painting it's less detailing, and the compositional structure is very simple. So, it does not necessarily mean that if it is a court painting, it has to be very complex in nature. A painting can be very simple despite the fact that it is a product of a court culture. So, it depends on what kind of aspiration and visual culture is involved, and what kind of visual perception is involved in the way one looks at a painting, way one looks at the very function and meaning of the existence of painting. Then you also have this factor of materiality, particularly in traditional Indian sculpture, played a very important role. Of course, there are factors like subject matters, like the content, like a particular objective or aim, why a purpose, why you are doing this particular sculpture. Having said that, the material quality if it is a stone or a bronze, whatever it is, it does play a very crucial role in conceiving a particular sculpture and also in executing. Now, here you are looking at the statue of a king, a very bold and powerful king, and in order to express the boldness of this character, in order to express the uprightness of this character, in order to express the royal power of this character, the sculptors used the stability of the stone itself. So, this is a very interesting kind of visual perception where an artist uses or utilizes the character of the material itself to convey the character of the figure you are representing. So, the strength and power of the king becomes synonymous with the strength and power of the stone as a material, or for that matter this one. This is very famously known as the statue of the Headless Kanishka, or the Headless statue of Kanishka, the great Kushana king. Even if you do not get to see the head, because this is how we found it, still looking at the rest of the figure, the body, the posture, the way the figure is standing with two legs slightly apart from each other. I mean, forget about the swords and other weapons. Simply look at the body, the torso, the very execution. It evokes enormous strength and power, which comes not only from its symbolic representation of the body, but it also comes from the medium that is used to execute this. And here, like the previous one, once again is stone, a very reliable medium or material for these sculptors to convey this sense of strength and power. Then you have a slightly different medium like terracotta, which is basically clay and later kind of fired in furnace. Now, terracotta being a very soft and malleable material, the sculptor or the artist has enormous scope of playing with the medium, because it is very soft, because it quickly kind of reflects the impression of your fingers or hands on the clay. And clay has this wonderful character of not only responding to the pressure of your hands and fingers, but also it has a wonderful kind of character of and its ability to hold that response. So, the moment you make an impression on the clay, the soft wet clay, it is going to remain there forever unless you erase it off. So, this softness and malleable character of the clay also becomes a part of the visual perception, in which these terracotta artists are creating these wonderful expressions of these figures placed on the terracotta temples, mainly in Bengal and other places. And another important aspect to understand the relationship between the visual perception and the visual culture in the context of Indian art is to pay attention to the narrative aspect of Indian art. Not all Indian art is narrative. There are many examples of Indian art which are iconic in nature. Of course, even in an icon there is a story, but in iconic sculpture or the iconic images in painting, the stories are not so conspicuous, they are not so explicit. It is implicit within the iconography of an icon. But there are many examples of explicit narrative sculptures and paintings, like this one, this particular relief panel from the Bharut Buddhist sculpture, which was a part of a stupa that belonged to the Shunga period, is actually a storytelling composition, though told in a very brief synoptic symbolic manner, but the attempt is actually to convey the particular story, and in this case it is all about the birth of Buddha. And you can see the elephant hovering above Mayadevi, mother of Buddha, and she is lying on the cot, and then you have a few attendants seated right beneath or beside the cot, and rest of the details of the story are not told here in a very detailed or explicit manner, but this synoptic narrative, this brief narrative composition could immediately provide the clues to the worshipper, to the devotee, to the visitor who knows a little bit about the Buddhist stories. By and large, throughout Indian art, we see a number of examples where narrativity or narrative elements are shaping not only the visual perception that is reflected in their art forms, but also in the visual perception that is reflected in the visual culture of a particular period. For example, this one. In this pre-Mughal painting, you can see once again there is an attempt to tell you a story, that how this man below is trying to elope with his beloved who is living in a palace upstairs, and how right next to that bold man, the hero, you see a sort of a security guard person who is supposed to take care of the princess and everybody else, but instead he is looking the other way around as if to enable these two people to run away from the palace. I mean, you can read the story actually, provided you know a little bit about the context, but the point is that how this crave to tell you a story is shaping the visual language of the paintings and also the culture. Now, this famous scene or an event episode from the life of Krishna, when Krishna was slaying Aghasura, is depicted here, and the visual perception in the context of a narrative painting is such that the painter does not hesitate to show Aghasura twice in the same painting, though there were no two Aghasuras. There was just one Aghasura who was subjugated and killed by Krishna later on. But why the painter has to show Aghasura twice? Just to show slightly two different moments from the same incident. Now, that needs a slightly an alteration of our visual perception, because we know in our normal visual perception we see one object just once at one particular moment. We can't see that object appearing twice right in front of our eyes. But the painter makes Aghasura appear twice right in front of our eyes in the same frame, just in order to give some moments of passage from one particular point of the narrative to the next point. So, this is how the visual perception vis-a-vis the visual language and style of storytelling is changing in Indian art. Similarly, when you look at this wonderful relief medallion from Amaravati, you once again see a similar kind of visual device is being employed here. Though when you go by the story, it is all about one particular elephant who was a mad elephant, who was called Nalagiri, and he was creating havoc, and there was a lot of chaos in this town, and ultimately Buddha comes and subjugates him. But then why the same elephant has to be shown twice in the same circular frame? The reason is same, the logic is same, because you are now employing a different kind of visual perception in order to convey the story through this art form. If you are sticking to one particular visual perception, that no, when you see one object at one particular moment, you see it only once, you can't show it twice, then you can't do this thing. See, in order to recreate that narration in your art form, be it painting or sculpture, you take certain liberties from the usual visual perception or the perceptual experiences. So, space, in other words, in Indian traditional art was always conceived as something flexible and non-specific. Indian traditional artists have always played with the notion of space and the most exercising a great amount of freedom, and at the same time they have deliberately kept the space very non-specific, which will enable them to play with the space. So, space has always lent itself to be used as an ever-changing fluent phenomenon to suit varying purposes. That is why Indian artists have never hesitated to paint or carve on the most unusual spaces and surfaces like Ajanta or Mamallapuram. Here you see a particular spot in Mamallapuram where even this bare, open, huge rock surfaces were used happily by the Mamallapuram sculptors to create their artwork. Then in Ajanta, you have this strange but perfectly beautiful caves carved inside these monolithic rocks, and then you have sculptors and painters working together to adorn the walls, to adorn the pillars, to adorn even the ceilings. So, because of this notion of space, the space is something that is not fixed, that is not specific. Space is something that you can play with, you can make it very, very flexible. This very notion and a great faith in this notion have always helped the Indian traditional painters to use and go for a slightly altered visual perception, where space does not dominate, but you recreate space at every moment. One more photograph from Ajanta, what now looks like a perfectly finished and well decorated facade of one of the caves in Ajanta was at one point of time nothing but a bare monolithic rock. See, in order to even conceive, to imagine that this rock surface could be turned into a very well decorated elaborate facade needed a different kind of visual perception, where imagination and flexibility of space played a very crucial role. At the same time, when you look at the paintings inside Ajanta, you will be taken aback not only by the skills, the painterly skills that you see across the walls, but also by the observation skill. So, if we are always emphasizing on the alternative visual perception, if we are always emphasizing on the idea of a different visual perception, alternative visual perception, non-specific visual perception, imaginative visual perception, then how come in this particular painting, on this particular example, you see depiction of people each having its own characteristic and cultural features, which only goes to show that Ajanta painters were very, very observant artists. So, the visual perception in Indian traditional art has a peculiar mixture, a combination. On the one hand, you do have imagination, freedom, non-specific notion of space and color. On the other hand, you observe the life, you observe the people, you observe their social and cultural characteristic features very keenly, and you arrive at a visual language which enables you to incorporate all these factors. That is why it is possible for them, along with a plethora of symbolic and iconographic elements in Ajanta, along with narratives, imaginary narratives from Buddha's life and Jataka tales. You also have very human moments depicted in Ajanta painting, like this one, when Buddha was meeting his wife Yashodhara and son Rahul after many, many years since he left his palace. So, it is possible then for the traditional Indian artists to move back and forth, to create a space where he can combine the non-specific imaginary elements of visual perception with something that is very specific, something that is anchored in real life and real emotion. Then you have very imaginary figures in many examples of Indian art, but when you look at these imaginary figures, you feel as if these figures have just arrived from the life around at that time. So, once again this is also a brilliant example of not only of this affinity between life and art, but also when you look at the figure itself, the posture, this very strange and complex posture is also possible only when the sculptor has observed real life, real human figures, real anatomy very, very keenly, very carefully. Or for that matter, this terracotta figure. The entire expression, this very pathetic expression is possible because the artist had observed the person and their emotions very closely. Or this one. Even when a sculptor has to create an imagery of a woman leafing through a book, you can see that how with one medium, that is terracotta, the sculptor is trying to address different kinds of materiality. It could be the skin, that is human body, it could be the cloth that she is wearing, it could be the pages of a book that she is leafing through. Now, once again, instead of following a very realistic mode, what the sculptor is doing, that he is suggesting the material quality of each of these elements without going for a very straightforward realistic depiction. Now, when we talk about the visual perception of Indian art, the visual culture that provides a support system to this visual perception and visual art, we always need to keep in our mind that how the sculptors and painters all over India have always been trying to strike that balance between what is very tangible, what is really touchable, and what is actually very suggestive and not so specific. So, specificity of a visual experience combined with the non-specificity of another visual experience is something that the Indian traditional artists have always been trying to explore. So, in a place like Mamallapuram, you have imaginary mythical beings along with these very real life creatures, in this case these Hanumans, these monkeys, in a position and in a kind of gesture executed so warmly, with so much of empathy and tangible kind of feeling, that it almost evokes a feeling that these are real monkeys simply replaced with some stone. Now, mind you, stone itself, particularly the kind of stone, the granite stone used in Mahabalipuram, was a very, very hard stone. So, to transform a hard stone like granite into something very tactile, tangible and soft itself was a difficult task. But at the same time, when you go very close to these figures, you lose track of that soft sensibility of the monkey figures, and your attention is drawn more and more towards the porous, rough surface of the stone. The question is, how does a painter manage both these things? On the one hand, there is this strong presence of materiality, and on the other hand, there is also this very strong presence of the warm, tangible, tactile presence of life. For example, this one. It looks very decorative, almost like a pattern from a design, but when you look at this creature very closely, there is an accurate sense of the presence of the real creature, or this one for that matter, this turkey, a very, very exotic bird for the Mughal emperor, and he got it painted, and obviously to satisfy the particular objective of the painting, the painter had to observe and study that chameleon, this turkey, or for that matter this zebra very, very keenly. So, observation, that is real life observation, also played a very important role in shaping the visual perception of Indian traditional art, along with this element of non-objectivity and non-specificity. So, both these things could be used in one single painting like this one, this particular painting of Rajput school, but specifically from Kota. You can see that the composition looks little fabricated and reconstructed, but this tremendous force with which this tiger is running across or through the forest was not possible for the painter to show unless he has really observed the real tigers in real setting very well, or for that matter when the painter is trying to depict a very fearsome and a violent fight between the two elephants. So, real life observations and imagined visuals, Indian art excelled in both. So, that is why in a painting like this, when the birth of Jahangir is being celebrated, it is possible for the painter to include all kinds of elements in one single painting by opening up the space, by not adhering to one point perspective, but by creating multiple perspectives in the same space. And this is again another very important feature of many Indian paintings and sculptures, where we see that instead of a single point perspective, artists are using multiple perspectives, as if the viewer along with the painter is constantly moving, observing and depicting the incident or the situation. And that is the reason why what looks like these two figures floating above, they are actually not floating, they are also very well seated, but at another level the space, though it is the same yellow background space that continues throughout in the background, but really speaking it could be the same yellow color, but not necessarily the same space. How do you understand that? It is a sense of belief and a faith that you have to instill in yourself. And that is why in this famous panel from Mahabalipuram called Mahishasura, you have figures big and small, you have figures in varying scales, you have figures in different reactions and different movements, different actions and different directions, all put together, but nothing is clashing with each other. Then in examples like this, visual perception in Indian art allows the artist to create extremely imaginative visual formation. For example, it must have been it must have taken a while for the painter to imagine how he would show Trinavarta, which is a whirlwind kind of demon, a demon which never had any particular shape, but which was powerful enough to destroy everything like a storm. So, the painter comes up with a pictorial device. It was possible for him to come up with this only because the general visual perception in Indian art allowed the artists always to imagine within the framework of a certain kind of naturalism, within the framework of a certain convention. In a painting like this, which is completely from mythology, that is Mount Giri Govardhana of Lord Krishna, you also see how the painter is trying to include real life figures as his worshippers. Or for that matter, when the painter is trying to show the famous Queen Rupamati and the King Baz Bahadur hunting at night, the night is very well depicted by applying a very dark, almost a black dark color in the background, but that may not or should not make the figures, particularly Rupamati, Baz Bahadur and the two horses and the attendant figure and the dog, black or non-visible. So, this is very interesting. On the one hand, it is a dark night scene. On the other hand, the main figures are all very visible. So, self-illumination, that despite being surrounded by a darkness, one can illuminate itself by applying bright colors on that object or figure, is also another very interesting aspect of the visual perception in Indian art. And then of course, we have these very complex narratives where you can see the infant Krishna journeying from Gokula to Vrindavana, and how the whole lot of the entire paraphernalia, the everything, the entire people, the whole community is following this procession, which means the painter had to look at the immediate and contemporary visual culture, because that is how one imagines the dress, the costume, the vehicles and everything else, including nature. But then there are instances like this, when the painter has to show the palace of the Pandava brothers set ablaze, it is on fire. Now, how do you show that? You must have seen fire elsewhere. So, the painter takes clue from his real life observation, but at the same time he reconstructs this scene, this inferno scene, in a way that pictorially it becomes a very captivating moment. And then you have purely mythological incident happening in a purely mythological setting, like Varaha and Hiranyaka. They are like kind of fighting with each other, and they are fighting in a setting that is completely abstract. The background is full of abstract patterns, and this was required for this particular narration. So, visual perception, as we observe in these few examples, and you can go on and move on to observe many other examples, you will realize that visual perception in Indian art is not a matter of a very specific norm. Rather, it is a matter of an ever going, ongoing, endless explorations in the possibilities of extending the visual language, an exploration in the possibilities of extending the visual communication itself. Thank you.